Well, there was some drama this afternoon during the election of the House Speaker for the 119th Congress, but not as much as many anticipated. In the end, it took only one round. It took a while, but just one round of voting to re-elect Congressman Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House. Still, it was a journey, or perhaps more of like an obstacle course. Joining us now is Alex Miller, Capitol Hill reporter for The Washington Times. Alex, welcome to Washington Watch.
Hey, Tony, thank you for having me. I think that's very apt to say it was an obstacle course, kind of describing the events of today. It certainly could have been a lot more rough. Thinking of McCarthy's 4-day bout, but a couple hours in the chambers, a lot better than a multi-day affair.
There was a lot of external pressure for the members to kind of come in line. I mean, I mentioned the terrorist attack on in New Orleans that had a sobering effect. The president weighed in. We had two members, Keith Self and Ralph Norman, who were pulled aside with the speaker, and the president had a conversation with them. What was the sense there on the Hill as this was all unfolding?
Well, I think a lot of us believe that this could go beyond one round, right? There was plenty of holdouts that were making a series of demands, whether it was getting confirmation or some kind of deal set in place to have spending cuts, to have bigger changes in the upcoming reconciliation packages. And there was a feeling that these guys would stay entrenched in that, right? Just ahead of the vote, there was almost a dozen Republicans that were kind of on the fence with this thing. Ultimately, we saw three vote against Johnson on the floor. That whittled down to just Thomas Massie out of Kentucky. But there was a lingering feeling that we were going to be here for a while and that Johnson was going to hash it out with these folks. But to your point, President Trump did come in. For a while, he seemed to be kind of keeping things at an arm's length, right? We got an endorsement of Johnson just before the vote actually happened. And then he took two of those members, Ralph Norman and Keith Self, aside. And in that side door conversation, Trump called. And they discussed primarily getting more people involved in the reconciliation process. And that seemed to warm them over. And I don't think Johnson's quite out of the woods yet, but it does get things rolling for the Republicans and kind of their fresh start on this trifecta.
There were a number of members who did not vote as their name was called. It's alphabetical roll call. They didn't vote, even though they were in the chamber. Were they sending messages?
I believe so, yeah. So many of those were members of the House Freedom Caucus, including Freedom Caucus Chair Andy Harris, Andy Biggs, Ralph Norman included, Chip Roy, who's been a pretty vocal critic of Speaker Johnson's. And, ultimately, those guys did come around in the end, right? But shortly after the vote, they did put out a letter and statement saying, hey, we did this now so that we can get the certification process for Trump done, right? Like everybody is trying to coalesce and unify around moving ahead with Trump's agenda. But they're going to keep an eye on how Johnson handles things. And, part of that is including them in more negotiations, particularly when it comes to spending. I mean, that is their main thing. Let's cut the deficit. Let's cut spending.
So Alex, from your perspective, what's the alternative for those members?
Well, in terms of a different speaker?
Yeah, I mean, if they're we're going to keep an eye on things. We want to keep you on a short leash. So what's the alternative? I mean, we went through that exercise, 2 years ago, and it was a pretty painful exercise. And then, of course, halfway through the process, they pulled the rug out from Kevin McCarthy, and there was a lot of public discontent with the kind of that circus atmosphere that took place on the Hill.
Absolutely. Well, so I think there's a lot of folks that are very hesitant to try and touch that hot iron again. So for today example, in a couple hours, they're going to be voting on a new rules package to raise the threshold for that motion to vacate, which was used to get rid of McCarthy. Would they opt to go for a different speaker? In that letter they sent, they all but say that, right? They basically said, we're going to be keeping tabs and you got to meet these demands so that we can make good on Trump's promises and Trump's agenda. And if Johnson's the guy, they'll back him. If not, he's on pretty thin ice with them. But as far as an alternative, we had House Judiciary Chair Jim Jordan's name thrown out today, Representative Byron Donalds, along with Minority or Majority Whip Tom Emmer. He was considered today. Now, all those guys did run for Speaker during that month-long process. And Jordan was close, but as we saw, it didn't quite work out. There were folks that were upset with what happened to McCarthy, but as to if we'll see that happen again, I personally hope not, because it was a struggle up here.
I think, of course, there's a different environment because now it is a Republican president in the White House. It is a
Exactly.
Republican Senate, although marginal control over there, and so there's work to be done. I don't know that the country can tolerate another circus atmosphere like that. When there is so much work that the American people want to see accomplished.
I think, too, that today was really a true test of the power of Trump's endorsement, right? So Trump comes out and he says, Johnson's the guy. He's almost got 100% support. Let's get him as Speaker. And as we saw with some of the holdouts, they decided eventually to agree with the president. How long that agreement will last is questionable. We've already seen it be put to its limit when we were getting ready to leave for Christmas, right? Trump had requested that there be an extension to the nation's debt limit, and a lot of fiscal conservatives and debt hawks didn't like that idea. They voted against it. So they gave him a victory today, and as long as Trump likes Johnson, Johnson's probably going to stick around. We'll
Alex,
see.
let's talk a little bit about that rules package that you talked about.
Sure.
That's a pretty significant change, upping the threshold to 8 from simply having 1. That was something that was negotiated back before they left, before Christmas. What else is in that rules package?
So they actually added some last minute tweaks today. I'm glad you asked. So on the motion to vacate, it now changes it to where only a member of the majority party. So right now, only Republicans could decide to boot the speaker. So if 8 Republicans are upset with Mike Johnson, they could bring it to the floor and try to oust him. Democrats probably will not be keen to try to help him out this time. They did earlier last year, especially because he backed them on Ukraine funding. But this time around, most likely not. Some other changes include extending subpoena powers from the last Congress, particularly to get a hold of the Hur tapes, which were of the interview conducted by Special Counsel Robert Hur with President Biden when he ultimately decided to not follow through with criminal charges. I believe after that interview, he called him a well-meaning old man, something to that effect. But Republicans have been hounding the Justice Department to get a hold of those tapes, and this rules package would extend that. It also changes how suspension bills will operate. Getting into the weeds a little bit here, but effectively, say there was a major funding bill that was brought up under suspension, they could only do it Monday through Wednesday. They can't do that Thursday or Friday anymore, and that's got Democrats pretty upset so far.
So that's
like
a
I said,
concession. That's a concession to conservatives.
yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's included into this new package that is really has conservatives' fingerprints all over it, and Democrats are pretty upset about it.
Yeah, this was negotiations with the Freedom Caucus to, bring them along in the process, which was still interesting today. Many of them came supporting Mike Johnson, but kind of dragging their feet, kicking and screaming, even though so many concessions have been made for them.
Absolutely. And I think one big thing about how things worked out for Speaker Johnson in the last session of Congress is they had such a thin majority that for a lot of must-pass bills, he did have to deal with Democrats. And that really riled up a lot of conservatives, and they took that out on him in numerous different ways. It's not going to be a whole heck of a lot different. For at least first couple of months of this session of Congress, Johnson will
Right.
effectively have a 0 vote majority.
Right, and this is when the president is going to be advancing his 100-day agenda. So you can't lose a single Republican based upon you got Mike Waltz, who's going to be resigning to become the national security advisor to the president. Elise Stefanik, who is going to be has been nominated. Once she's confirmed to be UN ambassador, that's another vacancy. That's not going to be filled until I don't know until she resigns, and then they'll set. I think it's 90 days, 70 or 90 days. So he's going to have he's going to be walking a tightrope.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I mean, it is, I think the battle for the recent government funding extension that we saw right before Christmas gives us a really good taste of what these next couple months are going to look like. You're going to have the same issues cropping up. You're going to have the same voices getting mad. And I think you put it very well right there. Johnson will be walking a tightrope to get virtually anything passed. Now, of course, it does help that you have Republicans controlling the White House and the Senate, right?
Right.
But ultimately, whether they can coalesce and work together to pass a lot of Trump's big ticket items, especially in the first of two reconciliation packages, it's going to be a heavy lift, and people are going to have to compromise.
Well, the good thing is Mike has good balance, so I think he can walk that tightrope. Alex Miller, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us and giving us an update.
Absolutely, Tony. Thank you for having me.